Uh, well, um, well, I'm happy to be here in WIDER as we were part of the group that were in the initiation of WIDER. There was a Latin American gang with Frenkel, Nora Lustig, and others, Ocampo, I think, when those times when WIDER was downtown Helsinki and before moving to these nice premises. Well, yes, and rich. Uh, yes, not all have remained in academia. I will talk about the crisis in how the crisis affected Latin America, and basically I will make the point that Latin America was, historically, Latin America has been one of the continents or the regions that have been affected the most by turbulence in the growth in the international economy, whether in terms of trade shocks, recessions, booms and bust in lending, etc. And this comes back to the 19th century. I mean, Latin America, when there was a big crash in 1825 in London, which was followed by several default of sovereign debt in Latin America, Peru, Argentina, Chile, Mexico. Brazil was the only one that didn't default in that time. Then there was another big crisis in the Barings Bank in Argentina in 1890. In the 20th century, Latin America was hit hard also by the big depression in the 1930s. And also in the 80s, it was called the lost decade of the debt crisis, also affected Latin America very severely. In the 1990s, there was the Mexican crisis in 94, 95. Ecuador also suffered a big crisis in 99. In early 2000, Argentina was hit in 2001, 2002. Then it became this big crisis in the north, in the center of the world economy, in the US, and then spread out to Europe in 2008, 2009. And this time, Latin America was not that affected. I mean, there was no banking crisis in Latin America. That's important. There was a sort of missing financial crisis in Latin America this time. There was no exchange rate crisis. Some countries depreciated their real exchange rate, but this didn't create a serious balance sheet problems in the banking sector, in the big corporations, in government. It was very different from the typical adjustment of the 80s or part of the 90s. There hasn't been a sovereign debt crisis in Latin America. There are just two precautionary programs of the IMF with Colombia and Mexico, but this is money that has not been disbursed. It's just, if you need it, you have an open credit line. This is the flexible credit facility of the IMF, but no country has used it much. I mean, neither Colombia and Mexico. This is very different from the effect on Central and Eastern Europe, because you have in Eastern Europe, there is a program in Hungary with IMF standby. There is a program in Romania. There is a program in the Baltic countries, and so you see that Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe was hit much harder than Latin America this time. So I will try to explain why this has been the case and what are the sources of the resilience of the region in terms of macro financial factors, but also highlight some elements of vulnerability and long-term structural challenges that the region faces. Well, in terms of the strengths, let me show one graph before that. This is the annual rate of GDP growth per year in the last 30 years, from 1980 to 2009 in the region. You see that there is a very cyclical pattern. Years in the bar are up. The years you have negative growth for the region as a whole in 82, 83, then in 2002 a small recession, and then you have a somewhat larger drop in GDP in 2009, preceded by a boom in 2003, 2007. It is a turning point. So it's not like Latin America was not affected, but the difference this time is that it was not followed by a financial crisis, by an exchange rate crisis, etc. There was the financial component of the crisis, which makes the recovery much more complicated, was on the whole absent this time in the region. Well, the sources of strength. Well, the first is that after the Asian crisis, like other developing countries, Latin America started to accumulate international reserves at a very high rate. Here I have a graph. If you can see it there, this is the evolution of gross international reserves, again in the last 30 years, and you will see that starting in 2001, 2002, there's a big increase in the total stock of international reserves. This is the total sum for the whole region in this decade, the past decade. And this is basically a sort of a self-insurance mechanism. Countries didn't want to have to go to the IMF and buy all the conditionality that implies to go to IMF. Also, international capital markets don't have credit lines, countercyclical credit lines when you have terms of trade deterioration, etc. So the mechanism of risk diversification through lending are not there to the full extent. So you have to accumulate international reserves. Probably this is suboptimal from a cost-benefit